The first reading is from the book of Exodus, chapter 22. This is one of 4 chapters, a very long section in Exodus, which lists all the laws received by Moses on Mount Sinai, the laws of the Old Covenant. These are very demanding laws. They are designed to completely distinguish the people of God from the peoples around them. And there are 2 things especially that are to distinguish the people of God from all of these other primitive religions that surround them. First, they are to completely turn away from any worship of idols, that is, from any kind of mythological religion. So Exodus 22:20 says, "Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed." And the second thing that distinguishes the people of God from the peoples around them is their concern for people created in the image of God. Their understanding that every human being is created in the image of God, and therefore their great concern for the poor, where this image is suffering and not allowed to develop. So Exodus 22:22 today says, "You shall not molest or oppress an alien, a widow, or an orphan. If ever you wrong them, my wrath will flare up, and I will kill you." So, these 2 requirements of exclusive devotion to God and absolute respect for all persons created in the image of God come with a requirement of destruction for anyone who fails to observe them. Now that sounds rather disturbing oftentimes to our contemporary ears, and it sounds rather odd to hear God saying on one hand, "I am a God of compassion," but then on the other hand, "If you do not do what I say, I'm going to kill you and destroy you." The Hebrew term here refers to giving things over to the Lord by destroying them. And they could do this with anything. Sometimes when they conquered a town, God would say, "Well, take all the precious things in the town and burn them, destroy them, because I don't want you clinging on to these things and being distracted by them. So just devote them all to me by destroying them." So when we hear these words of violence from God in the Old Testament, we should not think of it as so much a threat of punishment of individuals, but we should think of it as something designed to purify the community from any influences that might harm their knowledge of God or distract them from the spiritual growth that God wants for them. Because remember, they're coming out of very, very primitive mythological religion, and this is not going to be easy. We see how God is beginning to develop a new humanity, guiding humanity out of this primitive religious practice that we started with. Israel began as a tribal people, and they lived in a world where violence, and especially violence in the form of warfare, was common. So God encounters them in the midst of this world, and Israel's encounter with God at the Exodus sets them on a path that is designed to transform them eventually as a people, but the transformation is a very gradual one. So we see Paul writing early on to the Thessalonians, praising them for how they've turned from idol worship and from mythological religion. So we see that by the time of Jesus, in fact, Israel has fully abandoned these practices of primitive mythological religion, and now they're ready to move on to yet another stage, a stage that is even going to be beyond all of these laws that require them to take such severe measures against idolatry. So Jesus begins the process of guiding the people of God away from all religious laws of any kind. So this is very interesting. So we see this next step of spiritual growth in the reading from the Gospel of Matthew. The Pharisees asked Jesus which commandment in the law is the greatest. So what the Pharisees want to do is they want to identify sins and prioritize them, and they're hoping to catch Jesus in some kind of mistake in setting the priority of different sins. So is it worse to kill or is it worse to steal? Is it worse to commit adultery or is it worse to envy? They want to lure Jesus into saying that one or other of the 10 commandments is more important than the others. So Jesus avoids the entire question, as he usually does. And Jesus says, well, look, spending time thinking and worrying about sins will not help you to grow at all. Jesus says fear of sin and fear of punishment is not going to help anybody to grow in the spiritual life. Jesus says if you want to grow in the spiritual life, then you have to learn to do things for positive reasons. If you only do things to meet the minimum obligations, then you're not going to grow in the spiritual life. If you do things only out of fear, then you're not going to grow in the spiritual life. Jesus wants us to desire the things that he desires. So he says this is the greatest and first commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments only. You can reduce it all down to these 2. These commandments are positive. They contain no threat of punishment. They contain no consequences of destruction. And so Jesus says this is why the whole law and prophets depend on them, because spiritual growth can't happen if we're only trying to restrain our negative behavior. Jesus wants us to learn to live the spiritual life for positive reasons. Love for God has to flow from knowing that we are created in God's image. Love the Lord with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. Heart, soul, and mind are what distinguish us as people created in the image of God, as human persons. We have hearts, we have souls, we have minds. This is what it means to be created in the image of God. We love because we are like God, and our life comes from God. And love for others has to flow from knowing that every person is created in God's image. If I love myself, and I want myself to grow as a person created in God's image, then I will want the same for everyone else. So Jesus says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. As you know yourself to be loved by God and created in God's image, well then it should be natural for you to want to love every other person who also is loved by God and created in God's image. By the time you get to the Gospel of John, the last Gospel to be written, the church has gone even further than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In the Gospel of John, all the commandments are reduced down to only 1. Not even 2, 1. Love one another as I have loved you. Jesus says, again, in John, that if we want to do everything in life for positive reasons, then we have to start with confidence in the love of God for us. Love one another as I have loved you. There is no greater love than this, to give your life for your friends. So we come a long way from Exodus to the Gospel of John. This is a long journey with a big change. Jesus reveals God's love for us in ways that the people of the Old Covenant could not even imagine. As Jesus dies for us, we are given the assurance that God does not want to punish us for sin. And we're given the assurance that God wants to enter into our struggles to give us power for new life. And when we're sure that God is really with us, then we're free to love others as God has loved us. As children, Many of us learn to obey God out of fear of punishment. But that is not adult Christianity. That is not Christian maturity. Sometimes we have to take our children on that spiritual journey, beginning with teaching them the rules and the consequences. God took the people of God on the same journey from Exodus all the way up to the Gospel of John. But we have to make this journey out of spirituality simply based on doing things because we fear negative consequences. We have to learn to live our spiritual life from a pure, positive desire to love others as we know ourselves to be loved by Jesus. Pope Francis says that this is what makes us missionary disciples when we can do this. Listen to what he says in Evangelii Gaudium. A true missionary who never ceases to be a disciple knows that Jesus walks with him. He senses Jesus alive with him in the midst of the missionary enterprise. Unless we see Jesus present at the heart of our missionary commitment, our enthusiasm soon wanes, and we are no longer sure of what it is that we are handing on. We lack vigor and passion. A person who is not convinced, enthusiastic, certain, and in love will convince nobody. So let's now come to fill ourselves with the love of